Got about a half hour? Like tech? Then you're in the right place. We at Paessler thought that doing a podcast would be nice. So we gave the task to our two best men. Their only flaw? They're British. Sorry about that.
Flaw? Well, we're going to do it anyway. Welcome one and all to episode 3 of the Geek and the Sales Guide. Did you ever think it would get this far, Simon?
I just can't believe we've lasted this long.
My name's Rupert Collier and I'm the sales guy.
And I'm Simon Bell and I'm the geek.
And we're sitting in an ibis in London, as we were, in fact, I believe, last time.
Yeah.
However, we haven't left it quite as long between episodes this time, which is an improvement. I've been to see Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers at the HST Festival, I think it was called, in Hyde Park, which was very good. Nobody in head office knew who Tom Petty was, so they weren't particularly impressed when I told them where I was going.
That's because they're considerably younger than us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Stevie Nicks was also playing, ex-Fleetwood Mac, yeah. I've also been to see the Meatloaf musical. Meatloaf was my... Bat Out of Hell was my very first album, Simon. What was
yours? Would you be surprised if I said it was mine also?
No.
Seriously.
You're not.
For a long time, it was the only album I owned.
Really?
Yeah.
And did you have it on cassette?
No, I had it on vinyl.
Ah.
In fact, I've still got it on vinyl. It's one of 5 vinyl records I still own.
Wow. Gosh, well, I had mine on cassette. It was given to me by my mother, and God knows where it is now. But it remains, for me, certainly the best album of all time. The Tube was, I have to say, unbearably hot, and we shouldn't take this topic too lightly, I suppose, because there's currently a massive heat wave in big parts of Eastern Europe. But I have to say, I don't know how the boys in the city boys cope with their shirts and ties in the Tube during the summer in London. It's unbearable, even in shorts and t-shirts. So, Spain recorded the highest ever temperature ever in their history, 47.3 degrees in Cordoba.
47.
Which is in the south of Spain. I would have guessed the middle of Spain because that's where Madrid is and that's where all the high temperatures are, but no. And we've also won the CRN award for our partner event last year in the UK. We were up against Microsoft, NetApp, Sonic Wall and a couple of other entries with combined revenues of over 100 billion for those companies, and we won, Simon. We won. Little old Paessler.
Small but scrappy.
Anyway, so we're up on the new platform as well, which is working well. We're automatically syndicating the content out to iTunes. We can't seem to get any stats back for some reason from iTunes. They don't seem to want to release podcast stats, but I gather that may change in the future. I heard this morning that may change. But we did have some feedback about the last podcast, which, as I say, was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And apparently we were being a little too parochial in parts.
Parochial?
Well, it was too British focused, apparently.
Okay.
Too UK focused. Okay. So we're going full international this episode, Simon. I'm going to do the entire episode in my Inga from Sweden accent. That's probably a bit niche, that joke, isn't it? Have you seen Trading Places?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the sound of immigration plunging up the stairs.
And to maintain the theme that we have developed over the last few episodes, we're going with an Italian beer this time. We had German the first podcast, French the second podcast, and now Italian. So there were plenty of others to choose from, actually. We could have had Australian, American, but we went Italian. So, in the theme of internationalisation, let's get cracking with section 1, which is pretty random thingamagigs. So we start section 1, pretty random thingamagigs, with international stupidity. Stupidity is not confined to North Wales. There are plenty, which is where Simon lives. There are plenty of other places where stupidity is rife. Starting with Texas. Texans carry guns. I think we all know this. A gun to a Texan is like a black umbrella and a bowler hat to a London city worker, or I don't know, a smartphone to a teenager or something like that. Anyway, a man in Texas has been injured by his own bullet. He tried to shoot an armadillo, but the bullet ricocheted back into his face. Now that's quite stupid. According to Reuters, the state of the armadillo was unknown because they couldn't find it, which I presume, hopefully,
means it was pretty alright.
Yeah.
I mean, that's instant karma, really, isn't it?
The state of the man wasn't actually mentioned, other than to say he'd been flown to a nearby hospital where he had his jaw wired shut. Example 2 of international stupidity brings us back to these parts, namely the Netherlands, which isn't obviously these parts. By these parts I meant the Eurozone, something which I'll have to change for future podcasts. Used to seeing lots of people, obviously, at the moment with stuff on top of their car, it being holiday season, bicycles, rooftops, all that kind of stuff. But a man in the Netherlands was recently arrested with 2 lampposts attached to the top of his car. Now, the most interesting thing about this story was that it wasn't like an estate car or a pickup or something that you would expect.
Something beefy.
It was a Renault Twingo. A really short, dumpy 2-seater, or is it? I don't know, maybe it's a 4-seater, but it's a tiny little thing anyway. And when the police questioned him as to his intention with the 2 lampposts, they didn't quite get an answer out of him. They did, however, establish that he had no insurance, no MOT, no driver's licence, and and had done a runner from the local petrol station an hour before for not paying. So it's safe to say he wasn't having the greatest of days.
Well, inquiring minds want to know what he was doing with the lampposts.
I know. I'm still waiting for more information on that, but I'll get back to you. Maybe we'll find out for the next episode. And for the third example, we come much closer to home, namely Newcastle. And there's a pub in Newcastle called Filthy's. And for those of you unaware of what filthy means, it means dirty. And what better place to have a bar called Filthy's than Newcastle? Anyway, this lad was obviously feeling the green monster a little because he understood his girlfriend was going there to a hen do, and he actually sent a message via Facebook to the bar asking if, and I quote, "I was wondering if I would be able to pay a member of staff to keep an eye on her and make sure there's no men at their table, etc. I don't want the staff member to let the group know." I think that couple need to work on their trust issues.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that brings us to the end of international stupidity. Moving straight ahead, obviously stupidity can only end one way, and that is with deaths. So we've had international deaths since the last podcast. Now, last year, 2016, as you will no doubt remember, was famous for celebrity deaths. Mm-hmm. We had any number of celebrity deaths last year. Prince, Muhammad Ali, David Bowie, Arnold Palmer, George Michael, Gene Wilder, Fidel Castro, Debbie Reynolds, and of course her daughter Carrie Fisher. Well, since our last podcast, we have had a couple of deaths, but not human deaths. We've had the death of Flash, and I don't mean Flash Gordon, the cartoon character.
Much loved browser plugin.
I mean the much loved, much maligned browser plugin made by Adobe. One that Apple and Google mistrusted so much they refused to support it. That's apparently been announced as now going end of life in 2020 and is mostly replaced already, I gather, by HTML5. So, question to you, Simon, will we miss it?
Speaking purely personally, no. And I think Adobe and Apple were way behind my curve in dropping it. I've not had it on any of my systems for years.
Is it security reasons?
Vile.
Right.
Absolutely vile.
Okay. Fair enough. Another death that's happened since our last podcast was the demise of petrol and diesel cars in the UK from 2040, I think it is. And this follows a decision made by the French. They will be outlawed. You will no longer be able to manufacture petrol and diesel cars. So presumably, it hasn't actually stated this, but I'm guessing that you'll have to produce electric cars. Is that right?
I would guess so, yeah. Because hybrids have combustion engines, so if they're going to outlaw all combustion engines, then you can't even have a hybrid.
So this means a real sea change in electric charging, presumably. It's got to be obviously very widespread, which it isn't at the moment in the UK, although they are working on it, and fast. You don't really want to be kind of hanging around British motorway service stations longer than you need to, do you?
Not at all.
And I have one recommendation. Don't put Apple in charge, excuse the pun, because if they are in charge, the cars will run out if you leave the radio on for too long. The charging cords will cost thousands, and they'll probably break after a few months. And obviously they'll change the connector technology every few years, and we'll have to buy car charger adapters.
And you would only be able to buy Apple-branded electricity.
Yeah. On a slightly more serious note, will this reduce the power, do you think, of the Middle East? Because obviously they thrive on the provision of oil, which then becomes petrol once it's refined.
There's a whole pile of interesting conversations to be had about the demise of fossil fuel reliance, because there's an awful lot of economies rely on it completely.
Does that mean, do you think, that we'll no longer have Arab billions pouring into world football? Because I don't know if you noticed, but I know you're not a football man, and neither am I. But this did make headline news across the world. A young lad by the name of Neymar. They don't seem to be able to print first names when it comes to football stars. Ronaldo, Romario, etc.
Well, there isn't room for all the names on the back of the shirts, is there?
Neymar went from Barcelona to Paris Saint-Germain, who are, I think, funded by Qatar, for the cool sum of €220 million a couple of weeks ago.
I did hear about that, and I think you're quite right. There's a big political element there, because Qatar's been having quite a lot of trouble with their neighbours of late. So I heard a report suggesting that this Neymar funding was basically the Qataris raising a middle finger to the rest of the world, basically showing that
show of strength.
Yeah, they're not particularly concerned.
He's going to earn €600,000 per week after tax. I mean, don't get me started on football. Just to put it into context, Air France KLM also spent about that, but for that they got 31% of Virgin Atlantic. And Paris Saint-Germain got a bloke who's quite good at football.
So how much is he earning a week?
€600,000 per week after tax.
You wouldn't get out of bed for that, would you?
That's a hell of a lot of PRTG licenses. And the final thing that died was me laughing at the news about a certain Marketo. Marketo is a $1.8 billion company, so not exactly small, right? And I hope we're not censored for this. But one morning in July, there was a person within Marketo whose day presumably didn't get off to the greatest of starts, because it transpired that they'd forgotten to renew the domain marketo.com. Now, this was obviously their main domain, their trademark domain, and it's used for pretty much all of their marketing activities. They're basically a marketing company, and a marketing automation company. So it's used for all of their activities, all their emails, and according to the register, and again I quote, the corporation's marketing emails use marketo.com links to track user interactions, and suddenly every hyperlink, image and form in millions of client emails went dead. The company's main website vanished, so clients were unable to log into their accounts, and its apps failed. That's not a good day, is it?
That's not a good day.
Don't we have a censor for that?
We do have a censor for that. We could have helped alleviate that, eliminate it altogether. The interesting solution to that is apparently one of their customers realised very quickly what was happening. He's a DNS expert. He realised what the problem was and kindly re-registered the domain name for them.
In his own name?
Yeah, it cost him something like $10.
Oh,
so
dear.
Literally for a ha'porth of tar.
Oh, well. So we've done international stupidity, we've done international deaths. I'm quite proud of this segue, Simon. It's one of the finest segues in history, I reckon. According to Benjamin, I thought it was Mark Twain, but in fact it was Benjamin Franklin. Nothing is certain in life except death and...
Taxes.
So I thought, let's do international taxes. Germany. Let's start with Germany, our favourite nation of all, because that's where Paessler is based. In Germany, and I've lived there, so I know this, I had to pay this for a while, you do have to pay a ridiculous amount, not necessarily of tax, it's kind of commensurate with most other, civilized nations, but you do have to pay a ridiculous amount of different types of taxes, and I don't know whether we just bundle them all up into one or they list them out anyway, and one of them is church tax. You have to pay, if you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you have to pay into the church. So rather than going to the church and getting a cat passed around halfway through, this is much more, as you might expect from the Germans, much more refined, much more efficient. They take it at source. You also have to pay a rainwater tax. So if rain falls on your roof, you have to pay tax to get rid of it.
Are these all municipal taxes rather than federal?
No. Church tax is a federal tax. Rainwater might be municipal, I'm not sure, but church tax is definitely a federal tax.
So do you only pay the church one if you go to church?
Yeah, you can what they call step out of the church. You can renounce your Catholicism or Protestantism or whatever, but you have to do it formally by letter. This is no whimsical decision that you're being asked to make here. This is something you have to actually commit to.
And presumably they charge all the faiths at the same rate.
I don't know.
You couldn't look on Monday morning to see who's giving you the best discount that week.
That's a great idea.
We'd have a censor for that.
And the final tax from Germany that I thought was incredible. I mean, I didn't know about it because at the time I didn't own one, but it's a dog tax. And this is a municipal tax. Apparently, according to our esteemed inside sales colleague Victoria, you have to pay for a small dog like hers a couple of €100, but up to €1,000 for a large dog like mine is, a German Shepherd. And to be honest, Ginny cost that to buy. I wouldn't want to pay for it every year. And then, finally, there's one other, the solidarity surcharge, which is to help pay for the costs of German reunification in 1991. They're still paying that today. It was supposed to be a temporary thing, I understand, a bit like the toll on the Severn Bridge going into your country.
And the Mersey tunnels.
Yeah, also supposed to be temporary. Yeah. Queen Elizabeth's Bridge, I think, going over the Thames was also supposed to be temporary. There was a running gag that you had to pay to get out of Wales, but you didn't have to pay to get in. Is that still the case?
Yes.
Excellent. Moving swiftly on, Denmark, you have to pay a tax for cow flatulence. According to some studies, cow flatulence accounts for up to 18% of Europe's greenhouse gases. So Danish farmers now have to pay a flat charge of $110 per cow, regardless of how much farting that cow does.
And the rest of the methane output is taken care of by podcasts.
Well, it seems a little bit unfair to have a flat charge of £110. But what if one of your cows is like
flatulent charge?
What if one of your cows is like a really healthy eater and doesn't have stomach problems? Yeah. Anyway, and finally, in this section anyway, China. In 2009, in the central Chinese province of Hubei, they decided they needed to boost taxes, so they made everybody smoke cigarettes. Now, we normally pay huge amounts on cigarettes in tax in this country, in the UK, ostensibly to stop us smoking, but the Chinese decided to actually set quotas. One village was instructed, for example, to purchase 400 cartons per year for their officials to puff through. They needed an economy boost, only in China.
How bizarre.
Yeah. And just going back to the death thing, I was thinking, and this isn't in any way morbid whatsoever, but I would quite like to be around 70 now.
Well, 5 or 6 years, you'll be there.
Says you. Because, quite honestly, I think the baby boomer generation has had it all. And I've listed certain things that I believe the baby boomer has had that potentially we haven't. They were born after the Second World War, so they didn't have to go through the whole rebuilding thing. But they did kind of benefit from the post-war spirit. They obviously, their parents rebuilt our country, so they were brought up in a very kind of effervescent way, shall we say. That also meant that they were right bang at party age when the 60s happened. So they experienced the whole sexual awakening thing and a very sort of laissez-faire attitude to weed. So that must have been quite good fun. Mm-hmm. They grew up with some of the biggest and the best people, bands, etc. of all time. Beatles, Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, The Who, Led Zeppelin, Queen, Elvis Presley. All these people were the acts of their time. We, unfortunately, had the Venga Boys, Jedward and Justin Bieber. Have you heard Justin Bieber is taking a break from music?
No.
There is a God.
Who's Justin Bieber?
Oh, Simon. Maybe you are a baby boomer after all, are you? They grew up with some of the greatest actors of all time: Marlon Brando, Robert De Niro, Elizabeth Taylor, Jack Nicholson, Al Pacino, Audrey Hepburn, Dustin Hoffman. The list is endless. Clint Eastwood, Sean Connery. They also grew up with some of the greatest sportsmen of all time: Muhammad Ali, Pele, Jack Nicklaus, Babe Ruth, Billie Jean King. Are you with me so far?
They had it all.
They did. They lived through the Americana era, which I always love. The whole kind of small town America, good old days type stuff, typified by the Coke bottle, the archetypal Coke bottle shape, and those amazing cars that you now only see in Cuba, the Marlboro Man, all that kind of stuff. They also benefited from enormous growth in wealth and well-being, underpinned primarily by housing in the UK. My parents, I think, bought their house for about £15,000. It's probably worth, I don't know, a lot more than that now. They're living longer and a lot more easily thanks to massive advances in healthcare and disease treatment. And the thing that got me thinking about this primarily was the fact I was having a conversation with my girlfriend about life before the internet. And we, I think, were the last generation. Certainly, I'm 42. I can just about remember, almost 42, just about remember life before the internet. But they can remember life properly before the internet, can't they? How they did things without the benefit of Google, for example. But they've also still got to see what's possible with technology. They've been able to interact with it to some degree, not always maybe particularly effectively. My mother still starts a new email every time she wants to reply to. Rather than hitting reply, she closes it down, starts a new one, and puts... Okay. So anyway, I'd be quite happy popping off in the next few years after a life full of that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, given your salt intake over the weekend, that could be
arranged. For the benefit of listeners, I made a recipe by a very well-known chef who shall remain nameless in case he sues me. But his recipe for pulled pork included, and this was a 1.5 kilo pork joint, and included 50 grams of salt. 50. Your average daily intake, recommended by the NHS, is 6 grams per person. This recipe allowed for 50 grams of salt. I'm still getting over it now.
It was just an excuse to drink lots.
I don't need an excuse for that, Simon. You should know that by now. So yes, and last but not least, another thing that's happened since the last podcast is that my sister celebrated her 10-year wedding anniversary, and she got a lovely eternity ring and got taken out for dinner and all that kind of stuff. So do you know anybody else that's celebrated their 10-year wedding anniversary, Simon?
Apart from myself and my good lady.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
What did you do?
We went out for afternoon tea at the local pet cemetery.
Right.
That's not actually as bizarre as it sounds. They have a fantastic tea room and cafe. So we went for afternoon tea. The complication is that Arlene, my wife, is effectively a vegan, and as we've already mentioned, we live in rural North Wales, and finding places that can actually serve half-decent vegan food in rural North Wales is something of a chore. God. But the pet cemetery at Brynford, with a couple of days' notice, will actually lay on a full vegan afternoon tea.
Fantastic.
And it was splendid.
I saw a very funny tweet the other day. Somebody posted their dinner, as is people's wont these days, particularly on Instagram. But it was a vegan lady who posted her dinner, and she said it was the most sensational vegan dinner she's ever had. Do you know what it was? It was a load of tomatoes cut up, topped by rings of red onion. That was literally it.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. One of our colleagues from the States, Amanda, she's a vegan, and one of the last times we were all together in Germany, we all went out for a meal, and veganism doesn't seem to be a big thing in Germany, or at least not in Nuremberg anyway. And the only food that they could come up with for Amanda to eat was literally a dinner plate full of sliced tomato. Not even any lettuce as garnish.
Any dressing?
No, nothing. A dinner plate full of sliced tomato.
Fantastic. Right, we've got to crack on. That's the end of section 1. Let's move on to section 2. Paessler reveals the goods. Again, PRTG for the uninitiated. Bit of news from HQ is what this section is all about. We start, as usual, with the blog review, and as mentioned, we are a very content-driven company. So here's the last few blogs that have gone to press. Water for the coffee machine, fire for the barbecue, security for the data centre, by one of my colleagues, actually, Sebastian Kruger, talking about how to implement environmental monitoring. I like Sebastian. He's a nice chap. Great hair as well. Really good hair.
Some hair, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, there is that. But you can tell he's of good stock because he's got really thick hair, you know. How network-enabled devices escape your attention. Don't leave UPS, HVAC and CCTV cameras blind and powerless. Now, this is quite an interesting topic. It's not written by anybody in particular, but it's an interesting topic because of the DDoS attacks that we had last year. There were several that hijacked IP cameras and baby monitors and things like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, have a read of that. Your laptop is not too slow. End the discussion with PRTG client monitoring. One of your colleagues this time, Heather Pecan, in the US, all about monitoring client machines. And finally, this Exchange guide just won't go away. Part 2 of how to use custom sensors is called Your Secret Weapon for Monitoring Exchange, Custom WMI, Perfmon and Script Sensors, written by a guy called Simon Bell.
Splendid fellow he is too.
Tell me all about, in literally about 30 seconds, tell me all about what you've written.
Okay, well, the summer period is typically relatively quiet for pre-sales. You know, there's not many shows and customer events, so we're all turning our attention to writing blog content. And because of my background as an Exchange admin, I've taken on the task of writing a series of articles about how PRTG can be used to make the Exchange administrator's life better. Because it's such a broad subject, we've decided to split it out into a number of articles. The first one looked at the standard out-of-the-box sensors that ship with PRTG and how they can be used to give an admin a really good insight into what's happening in the environment. The second article, we looked at more of the custom sensors, predominantly focusing on things like Perfmon. Now, just as an example, my demonstration Exchange server has over 4,500 Perfmon counters just to do with Exchange.
Blimey.
So there's a huge array of stuff there that can be monitored. And through using PRTG's custom sensors, we can look really deep down to see exactly what's happening with an Exchange system.
Under the hood, as the Americans say.
Under the hood, yeah. So that article looks at how we can use our custom sensors with all the great instrumentation that Microsoft provide. We look at things at how we can get at those metrics and extract the information from Perfmon and get it into PRTG. And then the follow-on articles for that, we're going to actually look at different categories of Perfmon counters. So the part 3, which will be published in the next few weeks, looks at processor and process counters. Then in subsequent ones, we go on to look at things like memory utilization and transport queues and things like that. So
very good.
Some good stuff coming.
Excellent. Okay. Funnily enough, the best thing to come out of HQ... In fact, there is some stuff coming, but I'd get in trouble if I talk about it.
No, you can't. You can't.
Really?
No.
Not even a little...
No.
No?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. Anyway, listeners, there's some good stuff to come. We'll talk about it in our next podcast. Hopefully it'll be released by then. But the best thing to come out of HQ in the last few weeks didn't actually come out of HQ. It came out of one of our partners in Russia called Softline. And Russia's doing very well this year, due in most part, I believe, to this particular partner, Softline. And they have created some hilarious videos. They're a bit of an acquired taste, but they are very professionally done. And they use spoof scenarios to get across the business messages of PRTG. And the only advice I can give is just simply go to YouTube and put in PRTG Softline and you will find said videos. They are very, very funny. The first one is a wedding scene, and PRTG is being used effectively to make the bridegroom aware of the bride's propensity for things like, taking lots of selfies, dominating the bathroom, being bad in the kitchen, snoring, being messy. And it alerts him to all of these bad things about her. So he we have sensors for that. So he rewinds time with the use of PRTG. I didn't know we could do that.
What?
I know, it's quite a revelation, and hugely sexist, but very, very entertaining. And the second one is 4 lads watching a football match or something, and a burglar comes in, to which PRTG alerts them, and the crisps, the crisps bowl is empty, and also PRTG has alerted them to that, so they get more crisps or something. Anyway, I can't wait for the I can't wait for the third one. Believe me, they're a lot better than they sound. It's quite funny. So, that brings us to the end of section 2. Section 3, Personal Ramblings of a Techie Geek. Simon, over to you on this one. We have been asked on several occasions to do the 3D printing topic that we promised in the very first podcast. So I believe you are now going to cover that. Is that right?
Before I start, a question for you, Rupert. How old would you say 3D printing as a technology is?
Ooh, I've heard the term being mentioned probably for about 5 years, maybe 10.
What if I told you that actually works first started on it in the early 1980s?
Wowzers!
As a concept, it was first talked about in the early 80s. The whole idea behind 3D printing is it's also known as additive manufacturing, because unlike typical machining where you take a block of wood or metal and cut pieces off it, with 3D printing you're actually adding things to it. So it's
from the inside out kind of thing rather than the outside in. Is that the difference?
Well, it is additive. You know, you start with a blank space and you add things to it. Whereas with machining, you take a block of metal and you carve bits away from it.
Ah, okay, that's nicely explained.
So it's approaching it from the other side. So yeah, there was a discussion about how additive manufacturing could be used to speed up the prototyping of inventions and pieces of equipment. From these discussions, around about half a dozen different technologies eventually emerged, with the most common being what's known as stereolithography. And this uses a liquid, which is a photopolymer, which is in a tank, and a UV laser is flashed at certain points into that tank of liquid, and that solidifies the liquid. So there's a whole sequence of these flashes go on that trace out the shape of the object, which is then removed from the tank, and you have your finished thing. But the other one, the one that's really become the most popular now, is what's referred to as fused filament fabrication. So what this basically consists of is taking a long string of plastic filament and melting it and extruding it through similar technology to an inkjet printer.
Right.
So the melted plastic is squirted out through a nozzle and laid down in layers, and that builds up the object. Now, the first commercial printers really arrived in the early 1990s, and it's fair to say they were pretty crude and very expensive. And they also used proprietary technology, so that limited the options for lowering the prices and innovating. And then a British scientist, a guy called Dr. Adrian Bowers, came up with a different way of doing the filament printing. And he was very keen on open source, and he produced a printer known as a RepRap, and he published all the schematics into the public domain. And the idea with the RepRap printers is they were pretty much self-replicating. So if somebody had a RepRap printer, they could print all the parts to make another RepRap printer, and so it sort of grew by self-replication. And that almost coincided with the introduction of crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, which arrived in about 2009. And if you look at Kickstarter's history, you'll see that innovation in 3D printing is one of their most popular product types. So Kickstarter arrived, everybody started designing improved 3D printers, and they reached a sort of critical mass, fall in costs, increasing quality. So it really started to gather pace.
I don't know if you know, but in the Natural History Museum in London, in the big entrance hall, which is called Hintze Hall, they used to have Dippy, the Diplodocus.
Okay.
And he was excommunicated and sent on tour. They'd had enough of Dippy, and he was sent off to the regions. And to replace him, they actually got a gigantic blue whale that was found beached in Wexford in Ireland in the 1800s. Now, obviously, there were some parts missing, so they actually 3D printed all of the parts that were missing from the original skeleton. And they look absolutely perfect, obviously, as you might expect. And of course, they are true to scale, obviously, true to the shape, and it was very, very fascinating.
Well, medical applications are one of the really big areas that 3D printing is seeing use for. Obviously, you can 3D print prosthetics and things like that, but also bioprinting is a really big area. This is where they make sort of like a framework or a skeleton, seed that with human cells, and then they can use that to grow new body parts. It's a little bit Frankenstein, but they can do it with things like bone and cartilage and stem cells. So it's
fantastic.
A huge area. But it's not just medicine as well. It's pretty much limitless, to be honest. Product designers in almost every industry are now using 3D printing to rapidly prototype their products. So, for example, aerospace and defence industries, automotive, toy manufacturing, even clothing. Adidas are now starting to 3D print some of the soles for their shoes.
Wow!
So it really is a growth area.
So just give us an insight into, you own a 3D printer, right? Just give us an insight into what your 3D printer looks like, roughly, size and dimensions, and what you can do with it.
Well, the one I own is called a Raise N2 Plus, and it's an unusually large printer. It stands about 4.5 feet from floor.
That's taller than me.
Yeah, it's a fairly big beast. Again, the applications are enormous. I mean, I printed replacement parts for broken things around the house. A friend of mine is actually designing his own canoe, and he designed some special brackets that he needed, and I printed those for him.
What do you need to create a thing? What you must need some sort of measurements, or
there's a number of ways to do it. There are sites online such as Shapeways, and they have a massive library of pre-existing things that people have designed. And if you need a widget for a 1994 Renault Clio, almost certainly somebody's already designed that. So you go on Shapeways, you find what you want, you pay them some money, and it arrives in the post. That's all you need to do. It's off the shelf. Taking that a stage further, there are sites like Thingiverse, where again people have designed objects, but you can then download them yourself and print them on your own printer. Or a combination of the two. There are sites like 3D Hubs, and there you can take something that you've maybe downloaded from Thingiverse and send that to a bureau to get printed for you. Or you can design your own thing in a simple 3D design program, and 3D Hubs will print that for you.
Wow. So
they will actually put you in touch with a local printing service in your area.
Right.
And then you talk to them about price and delivery time.
So if people are interested in getting started with this, what sort of advice would you give them?
Printers range in price from a couple of £100 through to telephone numbers. And my advice would be, if you're interested in getting started, get a cheap one. Think very hard about the type of things that you want to print, and choose the printer that's most appropriate. There's tons of information about the capabilities, but read everything you possibly can and think about what you might want to print and choose the right bit of kit.
Fascinating.
It's very addictive. That's what I would say. I mean, we've already mentioned Amanda. She got a very basic printer for Christmas off her dad, and within 5 or 6 months she'd already outgrown that and has bought a bigger, better, faster one. So it's a real buzz. If you spend some time and design something in a 3D graphics program, a few hours later that thing is actually in your hand and doing something useful. It's a big kick.
Especially if you've just designed a shoe.
Indeed.
On that note, we are almost out of time. In fact, we're long out of time. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, I'm Rupert, and
I'm Simon. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.